Welcome. My name is Jeff Salomon. I am an executive editor at Texas Monthly Magazine, and I was the main editor on this book we're here to discuss today. Thank you. Lone Stars Rising, the 50 people who turned Texas into the fastest growing, most exciting, and sometimes most exasperating state in the country. I've been asked at the outset to ask everyone to silence their phones, and also to tell you that after we're done speaking, there will be a signing of the book there'll be books for sale in the lobby from Book People, and there'll be a signing in the sanctuary. I'm not sure where that is, but I'm told the volunteers.
The chapel.
In the chapel, I'm sorry. I'm told that you'll be able to go to the chapel to sign the books, and volunteers can point you in that direction. So, let me first introduce the panelists who are sitting here with me, very distinguished group. Let's do it alphabetically. In the middle there is Julian Castro. Julian is, I don't like not having a table. Okay. Julian is a San Antonio native. He is the former mayor of San Antonio, the former United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development during the Obama administration, and a former candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. Thanks for joining us today, Julian. San Antonio native, fellow San Antonio native Richard Z. Santos is the author of the novel Trust Me and a former board member of the National Book Critics Circle. He has written for Texas Monthly since 2020, and I can tell you Richard's origin story as someone who writes for Texas Monthly. One of the things I do at the magazine is I'm in charge of our books coverage. So every few months, I take a bunch of the advanced copies of books that publishers send me, and I go to a coffee shop with a pile of them, and I sit and read a whole bunch of them. Not entirely. I read like a chapter here, a chapter there. And so I read Richard's advanced copy of Richard's novel, Trust Me, and I got 2 chapters in and was just knocked out by his style and his ideas. And I immediately pulled out my laptop and Googled him and found his email address. And I emailed him, I think, right there from the coffee shop and said, "You need to be writing for Texas Monthly." And now he is. And then my colleague Patricia Sharp is the main food writer at Texas Monthly, where she has been on staff since 1974. I believe your first issue was February 1974. Do I have that right, or am I off by a month or two?
Yes, that sounds about right.
Okay, coming up on 50 years of writing for the magazine. Pat won a James Beard Journalism Award in 2006, and I can tell you Pat is just an absolute inspiration for everyone who works with her. I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but I go through phases where I'm more or less enthused about my job, and Pat has been writing about food and I think has just maintained the same level of enthusiasm for what she does throughout the whole time. If she doesn't, she does a great job of hiding it. But yeah, after all these years, she still comes up with fresh new ways to describe how food is delicious, which amazes me. Okay, so as perhaps many of you know, Texas Monthly is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Our very first issue was February of 1973, and we knew that as part of that celebrating the anniversary, we were going to put out some sort of book. We had a 4-book deal with Harper Wave. This book would be the 3rd book in our deal. The other 2 books are terrific. You should absolutely grab them. And so we were thinking about what did we want this book to be? And we knew right away we did not want the book to be about Texas Monthly. You know, we could have done a history of Texas Monthly, we could have done Texas Monthly's greatest hits, but that felt too inward looking to us. And to be honest, I don't think Harper Wave would have been terribly interested in those books anyway. So we knew we wanted to write about Texas, not about Texas Monthly. So we tossed around some more ideas. You know, it's like, should we write a book about the 50 most important Texans of all time? Or the 50 most important events in the history of Texas? Those all felt a little generic to us. It feels like people have done books like that, and we probably would have done a really good job of it, but still didn't hit us right. And we realized what we wanted to write about was the Texas that we have chronicled and witnessed over the past 50 years. The Texas from 1973 to 2023. And then we were like, okay, what if we wrote about the 50 most important events of the past 50 years? Or what if we wrote about the 50 most important people in Texas of the past 50 years? And it's like Texas is full of great characters, a lot of larger-than-life types. Let's go with that. And specifically, we wanted to write about Texans who had shaped and changed Texas. So not like the most famous Texans in the world, not necessarily the richest, but the people who had changed this state. And so we started brainstorming who would be in the book. And we talked amongst ourselves, we reached out to some people outside of Texas Monthly, and we worked up a list of, God, it must have been 200, 300 people. And putting that list together was really fun. And then we had to winnow it down to 50 people, which was a lot less fun. But we came up with a list that we were pretty happy with. And we made all the assignments for the book. And at the time, we really didn't have much more than a very general thesis. You know, our notion was, well, these have been 50 really exciting years in Texas. I mean, the state went from 11 million people to 28 million people during those 50 years, which is a phenomenal level of growth. But that was a very vague sort of idea. But we figured if we chose the right subjects and the right writers, and everyone did their jobs well, that some more specific kind of themes would sort of emerge organically from the process. And in fact, they did. And the first theme that I think really built out of the book, the really central one, is that Texas went from a somewhat isolated backwater in the early 1970s to being one of the most important states in the Union. And to sort of express that, I'd love to read you a brief passage from my colleague Stephen Harrigan's really terrific introduction to this book. Here's what Steve, who grew up in Texas, had to say. By the 1970s, nearly 80% of Texans were city dwellers, twice as many as there had been 4 decades earlier. But the state was still grounded in and hobbled by its own insistent cliches. Recent movies like The Last Picture Show had moved the needle a bit when it came to realistic depictions of Texans, but we were still conditioned to recognize ourselves in the panels of Ace Reed cartoons about lanky, bow-legged cowboys. Living in Texas back then, you felt cut off from a wider and presumably more cosmopolitan world. Blue laws, for instance, were still very much in effect. It wasn't just that you couldn't buy liquor on Sunday. If you needed a new mop, the houseware section of your local grocery store was literally roped off for fear that you might profane the Lord's day by buying something that would lead you to commit labor. It had only been 2 years since the Texas legislature overturned the law forbidding you from ordering a drink in a restaurant. And if you happened to be in the lounge car of a train, service was still suspended when you passed through one of Texas's 100 or so dry counties. You learned about what was happening beyond the borders of Texas from 30-minute news segments on the 3 broadcast networks or from your local newspaper. There wasn't yet a national edition of the New York Times or a self-appointed national newspaper like USA Today. Flights outside the state were expensive. Travel outside of the country remained, for a penurious freelance writer like myself, a maybe one day, once-in-a-lifetime dream. So that's how Stephen portrays Texas in 1973. And here, much more briefly, is Texas of today. Now Texas is a state from which the future seems to radiate outward in waves, the future of politics, of new modes of transportation, of scientific and technological breakthroughs, of private spaceflight, of energy, music, literature, of cultural conflict, and medical healing. So 2 very, very different places. And what we hoped this book would do was trace the arc from A to B, how we got from 1973 to 2023. So Texas during that time really grew much more integrated into the country. What happens here really affects the other 49 states. And then what happens in the rest of the country also affects Texas, and that's a process we wanted to get into this book as well. And that's partly ideas come here from Texas, from other places, but also people like me. You know, so many damn of us move here all the time. The vast majority of the people in the book are native Texans. But look at the ones who aren't. Dominique de Menil, Herb Kelleher, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, T. Boone Pickens, Karl Rove, Louis Black, Sandra Cisneros, Hugo Ortega, Dan Patrick. Those are people who have transformed this state, in some cases for the better, in some cases for the worse. There are other themes here as well. I think the rise of Austin and the rise of Houston are 2 big stories that you see happening in the pages of this book. And there are like many people from Austin in this book. And we don't have like a chapter about how Austin changed or how Houston grew. We tell those stories through profiles of different people who really had those sort of effects. So the book is really animated by a central idea. You know, when people think of the formative years of Texas, they tend to think of the 19th century. They think of the days of the Revolution, the Republic, the Alamo, of cowboys and cattle drives. But one could make the case, and I believe this book strongly makes the case, that the past 50 years have been the most eventful in our history. And so to discuss that, I'm going to have each of our panelists talk a little bit about the pieces they wrote for this book. Julian, you know, we say the book cover says that these are the 50 people who transformed Texas, but actually, because a couple of essays are about multiple people, technically speaking, there's 54 people in the book. And I had heard of all but 2 of them before I started work on this book. And one of the 2 I had not heard of was Willie Velasquez. Can you tell us a bit about Willie Velasquez and why he's so important? And, and I'm sorry, each person is going to read a brief passage from their essay. You're on page 50, I believe.
Well, and thank you, Jeff, for having me here today, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this. As y'all can imagine, this is a little bit off the beaten path for me as a recovering politician to get to contribute to this book. But for those of y'all that don't know, first of all, is anybody from San Antonio here? All right, we got some San Antonians. Willie Velasquez was the founder of what today is known as the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project. It was founded in 1973, 74, so around the same time that Texas Monthly started. In this state. He was a native San Antonian, and through his work registering voters and growing that organization, ultimately it had a profound impact on the number of Latino elected officials, not only in South Texas, but throughout the state and eventually the nation, and a growing sense that the Latino community had something to contribute. More elected officials, more people in nonprofits, in the private sector. And so I wanted to perhaps just read a part of my contribution.
Page 50.
50. So I think I'll read the very beginning and then a little bit of the middle and then the very end. Growing up as the child of a Chicana activist in San Antonio's West Side in the 1980s, whenever I heard someone refer to Willie, I didn't picture a long-haired, pot-smoking country singer strumming on his guitar. Willie, instead, called up a stout, raven-haired, and jabby-voiced political activist walking door to door with pen and pad in hand, a man on a mission to empower Mexican Americans by registering them to vote. Willie meant Willie Velasquez, the visionary founder of the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, who was also a product of the West Side. Let me skip to the middle. Willie understood the enormous power Latinos could wield to improve their lives if they turned out to vote. His genius was that he knew exactly how to make that happen. He formed Southwest Voter in 1974 with the purpose of registering Latino voters and educating them about the democratic process. His vision was groundbreaking. It just wasn't being done. Not in Texas, and certainly not in the Latino community, with the skill, scale, or fervor that Southwest Voter brought to it. Person by person, family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood, the group helped nearly double Latino registration nationwide over the course of 2 decades. More Latino voters also meant more Latino candidates elected to office. In the 5 southwestern states where it focused its efforts, the number of Latino elected officials jumped from 1,566 in 1974 to 2,861 in 1984. Su voto es su voz. Your vote is your voice, was Willie's exhortation to Latino voters. Every time I hear it, I get a lump in my throat thinking of the generations of Latinos and Latinas who never had the opportunity to fully use their voice, either at the ballot box or in life. They labored in fields and factories and homes as maids and gardeners, in faraway lands fighting for our country. They worked hard and often stayed quiet about the injustices around them at the risk of losing their job if they rocked the boat. Willie changed the game. And then this is at the very end. Willie was and is now a name synonymous with democracy in America, President Bill Clinton proclaimed as he posthumously bestowed on Willie the Medal of Freedom in a 1995 White House ceremony. Willie is one of the few Latinos ever recognized with the nation's highest civilian honor. He made a difference, and the powerless and the powerful have long known it, whether they reside in the West Side or the West Wing. I'm not sure who's next.
So, as you noted, Velasquez died fairly young, and I'm just curious, if he were to somehow reappear today and look around at the Texas political landscape, what would surprise him, for better or worse, and what would not surprise him at all?
Well, Willie passed away from cancer in 1988. I think, first of all, he would be surprised that it's a solidly Republican state right now, because as y'all know, in 1988, that was quite different from what we have now. But I think he would be, in some ways, very pleased at what has become of the effort that he started and improved Latino participation and progress, because we've made tremendous progress in the state and in the country. I don't think anybody can deny that. I think he would also be distressed maybe that there hasn't been more. And watching so many of the obstacles that still exist, I think, to true equity and equality. And more than anything else, I feel like he would still have that fighter spirit and activist spirit, and plenty to inspire him in the Texas of 2023.
Great, thank you. And I got to tell you, when we decided to write about Willie Velasquez, and I thought, let's ask Julian, who I didn't know at all before this process, to do the piece, because Julian grew up in activist political circles in San Antonio, back when Willie Velasquez was alive, and I thought, I'm sure he knows of him. Maybe he even, knew the guy when he was a child. And so I got in touch with him and asked him to do the piece, which he was enthusiastic about doing. My hopes were moderate for what sort of piece I would get in, because I've had experience editing pieces written by politicians, and they need a lot of work from editors.
But sorry for taking so long with it. I'm terrible with the deadlines. I'm terrible.
Journalists bust deadlines all the time. You're in good company. But then I got the piece, and there was that opening section about the two Willies. I don't think of Willie Nelson, I think of Willie Velasquez. And then there was that West Side, West Wing thing at the end. And I was like, oh, Julian Castro is actually a writer. In a different life, Julian Castro would have been a staff writer at Texas Monthly, And eventually he would have left us for the New Yorker, but that's how it goes. Great. So Pat, you wrote an essay about the Southwestern cuisine phenomenon and how it came to the fore in the 1980s. Could you read us a passage from the book and then tell us what was so important about that moment?
Yes, be happy to. And am I holding my microphone the right way? Can you hear me out there? Okay, good. Most of these essays in the book are about one person. Mine is actually about four people, because they were, and it could have been about more, but we had a really good picture with the four of them. It concerns the culinary state of the state in 1984. In the early 80s, Texas was wrapping up a huge real estate and oil boom, and new millionaires were eating and drinking lavishly at restaurants that served refined European dishes like beef Wellington and trout meuniere. A few of the young chefs at these restaurants, however, found themselves growing bored with the fancy food of the day. Elsewhere around the country, they noticed that other chefs had begun to challenge the dominance of French cooking. In New Orleans, Paul Prudhomme was making a splash with Cajun cuisine. In California, Alice Waters and Wolfgang Puck were champions of dishes with highly local influences. In New York, Larry Forgione captured the mood when he named his new restaurant An American Place. The Texas chefs sat up and took notice, and one of them was a Dallas culinary consultant named Ann Lindsay Greer. She had written a cookbook called The Cuisine of the American Southwest, and she saw similar ideas all around, and she was convinced that Texas chefs should be talking to one another. So in 1984, she organized a potluck, and she invited 6 other chefs who happened to be a who's who of talent from Houston and Dallas. And after the dinner, they sat around and talked, and one of the attendees remembered, "We talked for hours and hours, it seemed. It was one of those wonderful evenings when everybody's ideas are bouncing off everybody else's." The chefs left that potluck, and went home to start experimenting in their own restaurant kitchens. A Dallas newspaper story about the dinner had used Greer's term, Southwestern, to describe the food that was served. But what exactly was Southwestern cuisine? Fundamentally, it came down to putting a creative and upscale spin on the basic elements of Texas cuisine, and that included Southern recipes, Germanic traditions, cowboy techniques. But the dishes that the chefs found to be the most popular with their customers were Mexican. And it soon became apparent that this would be the heart and soul of the new cuisine that they were inventing on the spot.
Great. So you were around for this moment and writing about Texas restaurants for a while already. At the time, did you realize that something new was happening, or was it really only in retrospect that you realized how important it was?
I didn't find out about the potluck in 1984 until I did a story about Southwestern cuisine 10 years later. But at the time, the three of the Texas chefs who were the biggest names, they began showing up in newspaper stories that I was reading, like, Dean Fearing was, at Wolfgang Puck's, charity fundraiser in Los Angeles, and Robert Del Grande was doing something in San Diego, and, Stephen Piles was in New York. So, yes, they were getting around, they were becoming famous, and I think that the idea of a cuisine that had principles and, and dishes in common took a while, but these guys turned into rock stars in a period of about four or 5 years.
Yeah, I was living in New York in the 1980s, and I remember that food was definitely filtering up to New York, which was an unusual route. There was not a lot of cuisine coming from Texas to New York. New York prided itself on sending its cuisine out to the world. So were you getting, as someone who was sort of an instant expert on this, as Texas Monthly's food writer, were you getting called by, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or national food magazines asking, what's going on there exactly?
They were pretty much doing it all themselves. I think that it was almost the other way around. I was more interested in going to their restaurants and seeing what they were doing and writing about it and being sure that, our dining guide reviews were, up to the minute.
And I'm curious, so I moved to Austin in 1996, and when I got here, Texas barbecue was a revelation for me. Interior Mexican food was a revelation for me. Other than that, I found the dining options kind of middling, not all that exciting. I can't really speak for the other cities in Texas nearly as well. But tell us, you started writing about Texas restaurants in the 1970s, right? Do I have that right?
Yes.
Yes. And how would you describe what the culinary scene in Texas was like in the 1970s?
Well, there was definitely fine dining. There were expensive restaurants. But by and large, there was this phenomenon that people don't know the name of anymore called continental cuisine. They say, what continent are you referring to? Well, Europe, hello. And that was what fine dining was at the time. It was very Eurocentric, and it existed, but it was, there were few and far between. There might be, 1, 2, 3 fine restaurants. Hotel food, nice hotel food is more or less what I would call it.
Okay, great. Richard, you wrote about the writer and scholar and activist Gloria Anzaldúa. Could you read a passage from that and tell us a little bit about what was so important about her?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll read the passage which starts to get into her role as philosopher and activist. And my first sentence is very similar to Julian's first sentence, so, growing up in San Antonio in the 1980s and 90s, I called myself Mexican because all the brown kids called themselves Mexican. Nothing else made sense. I was a Mexican because what else could I be? The brown kids are Mexicans, the white kids are white kids, everyone else was who they were, nothing more needed to be said. I was nearly 18 before I began to realize Mexican didn't quite cut it. My mother's family has been living in New Mexico since the 1500s, when her ancestors, a mix of conquistadors and Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition, made their way to Santa Fe. My father's family has been in San Antonio or Laredo for at least 150 years. They're indigenous ancestors on both sides, not that any of us know their tribes or even their names. I knew I wasn't white, but was I actually Mexican if my forebears' presence here predates the existence of both Mexico and the United States? I'm going to skip ahead a bit. The power of Gloria Anzaldua's work in books such as Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, was to brush aside simple ideas such as nations, religions, languages, borders, and skin color in order to reach the complex, beating heart of what it means to live in the borderlands of Mexico and the United States, where we all live. The blending of Spanish and indigenous blood and culture and the United States annexation of Mexican territory, combined with the relative isolation that came from living in a remote region, led to new languages, new religions, cultures, and skin colors. The end result is Anzaldua's new mestiza, who doesn't act, sound, or think like other people, and who to this day still can't settle on a word for ourselves. Spanish, Mexican, Latin, Hispanic, Tejano, Texican, Chicano, Latino, Mestizo, Latinx, Latine, and many others left off or yet to be added. But that's the point. We'll never settle on a single term because a single term can't encompass all the experiences and identities that have emerged in the physical and psychic borderlands. Anzaldúa recast the new people not as mongrels or mistakes, but as hybrids, powered by ancient combinations and sometimes violent contradictions. As she said, "I am a wind-swayed bridge, a crossroads inhabited by whirlwinds." Hybridity is not always easy. Occupying an in-between space can be confusing, and it's easy to feel unrooted or threatened, even at home. In Borderlands, La Frontera, she wrote, "In the borderlands, you are the battleground, where enemies are kin to each other. You are at home, a stranger." And so, yeah, Anzaldúa was from the valley, the child of migrant workers. She worked in fields as a child and went on to become a really influential philosopher and activist and academic who really, there are lots of people doing this, but like she really played a huge role in kind of legitimizing the study of like the new mestiza, these like people whose Spanish was different than the Spanish spoken a couple hundred miles to the south, and whose English was different than the English spoken a couple hundred miles to the north, and whose religions still had some of the old weird kind of like spooky stuff in it, and and she legitimizes it. She talks about its revolutionary potential, and it's still really vital and exciting work to this day.
Yeah, my wife is an academic, and Anzaldua's name has come up. I've heard in discussions she has with some of her colleagues. She's a social scientist. So I think in 2023, we're all probably fairly accustomed to discussions of racial and ethnic hybridity. Anzaldúa was also a gay woman who I think flouted lots of sort of gender norms, and we're, I think, today fairly conversant with that sort of thing. She started writing about and thinking about these things in the 1970s and the 1980s when those topics were not so common. Do you have any sense of how difficult it was for her to be basically a pioneer in a lot of these fields?
Yeah, in her work, she takes that on like head on. You know, she talks about the internalized shame of her and her family members, not just about sexual identity or gender, but just this constant like whether it's a religious threat, whether it's like you've got to go on and like earn more money for the family, or all these different like sources of shame that it seemed that Latinos were particularly susceptible to, especially coming from these like more impoverished communities. And so I think that, you know, on the one hand, you want to say, oh, well, it's 2023 and we're like all better now. But like we were at my job, I run a creative writing nonprofit for kids. We work with a lot of like young queer students whose families don't know they're gay, who they know their families like today would kick them out of their house. Like, you know, so many things are better, but also so much of what she's writing about is still a daily struggle. That shame is still there. And I think she kind of like turns to that shame and turns it into like righteous anger and fire, which is just exhilarating to read.
So she was from Texas, but she actually did most of her important work, or at least wrote her books, after she had moved to California. Do you think that was an accident? Do you feel like she had to go to California to feel comfortable doing that kind of work?
I think probably. I think lots of writers have found themselves in similar things, right? Like James Joyce wasn't in Dublin when he wrote Ulysses. Like there's lots of people who look back from where they were. But I also think like, you know, there are probably lots of good reasons for her to leave Texas. And I think I bet everybody in here knows someone or is someone that is thinking about leaving Texas, has left Texas, is like, maybe I'm not going to leave, but what are house prices like in Wisconsin? What's Wisconsin like? Which goes back to like the future that you were talking about, Julian, in terms of like, is this it? Is this as good as it's going to get? Do we need to do something different?
Yeah. So this book is about Texas changing from 1973 to 2023 in a pretty profound way. Pat has witnessed all of that. Julian, who I believe turns 50 next year, has witnessed the vast majority of it. I'm not sure what your age is, Richard. Are you
43?
Okay, you've seen a great deal of it. I'm curious if each of you could just tell me briefly a little bit about how you feel about how your home state has changed beneath you over the decades. I'll let you. Whoever wants to go first. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I could go first. I sat down and I made a list of 5 things that were true in 1973 that a newcomer or somebody who was born after that would hardly believe. In fact, I hardly believe some of them. So in 1973, and these are mainly about Austin, in 1973, Austin had 2 tall buildings, the state capitol and the UT Tower. And you could see both of them, from several miles away. My father taught at UT, and we could almost see it from our house. And Austin was a safe city. It was, I meant to look up what the population was, but, like maybe 100,000, I would guess. It felt more like a small town, and I remember that I took swimming lessons as a 6-year-old, and I had to take a city bus to get there. And my mother took me down to the bus stop, and she got on the bus with me the first day, and she introduced me to the bus driver. And she said, I want you to sit up close to the driver. And she said to him, and I want you to be sure that she's safe. And and that was all that she did. And I think I took the same bus back with the same driver. You didn't worry. Bad things did happen in 1973, but you didn't worry about safety. It was pretty much, we looked out for each other. State government still felt like it owed something in terms of our higher education to the people of Texas. When I enrolled in the University of Texas in 1961, my tuition for the whole semester was $75. That was everything, because it was subsidized by the state. And so just to jump over really quickly to Texas Monthly, which was founded in 1973, computers had not been invented in 1973. We either kept clips of newspaper stories that we had read ourselves, or we went to the library to look things up. And when I left for lunch, I would come back and there would be a pile of pink slips saying, while you were out, and there would be telephone calls that I had gotten while I was at lunch that I would need to return. It wasn't exactly, printing press, Gutenberg Bible, but it's kind of close to it. And then the final thing, Mexican food in 1973 was still Tex-Mex. It was crispy tacos, yellow cheese, iceberg lettuce on top of that, and hamburger meat seasoned with Gebhardt's chili powder. It was quite a while before Southwestern cuisine and then the interior Mexican Revolution came along.
Thank you, Pat. I definitely want to leave time for some questions from the audience. I'll ask Richard and Julian if you could give just pretty quick impressions of what the last 50 years have been like.
Yeah, that's a lot, right? The last 50 years. I think I kind of think about it the way I think about my hometown of San Antonio. This place has become, Texas as a state has become more cosmopolitan, has become more urban, the mix of urban and rural has become more urban than it used to be dramatically. And the economy of the state has become so much more diversified in these 50 years. And I think that we've also, of course, made significant strides towards more fairness and equality, with a lot to go, but compared to 1973, for sure.
Thanks. Richard?
Yeah, I think those advances in fairness, equality, acceptance of identities, it's happening like across the state and also down through the different other demographics, right? Like there's one of my favorite shirts I see sometimes is like Latino women wearing a shirt that says Selena didn't speak Spanish either, right? 20 years ago, they would have been like, kind of like feel bad about not being bilingual. Now it's just how it is, right? And I think that's interesting, and it is a much more tolerant and diverse space. It's been a majority minority state for 20 years, but yet also the state legislature is less diverse than it was 20 years ago when we passed that mark. And so that feels like a kind of asterisk on all that.